Chapter 37 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Keiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 37. Ben Swann. Since the night when old Joe Cumberland died and Kate Cumberland rode off after her wild man, Ben Swann, the foreman of the Cumberland ranch, had lived in the big house. He would have been vastly more comfortable in the bunkhouse playing cards with the other hands, but Ben Swann felt vaguely that it was a shame for so much space in the ranch house to go to waste. And besides, Ben's natural dignity was at home in the place, even if his mind grew lonely. It was Ben Swann, therefore, who ran down and flung open the door on which a heavy hand was beating. Outside stood two men, very tall, taller than himself, and one of them a giant. They had about them a strong scent of horses. "Get a light," said one of these. "Run for it. Get a light. Start a fire and be damn quick about it." "And who the hell might you gents be?" queried Ben Swann, leaning against the side of the doorway to dicker. "Throw that fool on his head," said one of the strangers, "and go on in, Lee." "Stand aside," said the other, and swept the doorknob out of Ben's grip, flattening Ben himself against the wall. While he struggled there, gasping, a man and a woman slipped past him. "Tell him who we are," said the woman's voice. "We'll go in the living room, Buck, and start a fire." The strangers apparently knew their way even in the dark, for presently he heard the scraping of wood on the hearth in the living room. It bewildered Ben Swann. It was dreamlike, this sudden invasion. "Now who the devil are you?" A match was scratched and held under his very nose until Ben shrank back for fear that his splendid mustaches might ignite. He found himself confronted by one of the largest men he had ever seen, a leonine face vaguely familiar. "You Lee Haines," he gasped. "What are you doing here?" "You're Swann, the foreman, aren't you?" said Haines. "Well, come out of your dream, man. The owner of the ranch is in the living room." Joe Cumberland's dead," stammered Ben Swann. "Kate Cumberland." "Her and Barry the killing at Alder." "Shut up," ordered Haines, and his face grew ugly. "Don't let that chatter get to Kate's ears. Barry ain't with her, only his kid. Now stir about." After the first surprise was over, Ben Swann did very well. He found the fire already started in the living room, and on the rug before the hearth a yellow-haired little girl wrapped in a tawny hide. She was sound asleep, worn out by the long ride, and she seemed to Ben Swann a very pretty picture. Surely there could be in her little of the father of whom he had heard so much, of whom that story of the killing at Alder was lately told. He took in that picture at a glance and then went to rustle food. Afterward he went down to sleep in the bunkhouse, and at breakfast he recounted the events of the night with a relish. Not one of the men had been more than 3 years on the place, and therefore their minds were clean slates on which Swann could write his own impressions. "Appearances is deceivin'," concluded the foreman. "Look at Mrs. Dan Barry. They tell you about these parts that she's pretty. They don't tell you how damn fine lookin' she is. And she's got a soft look, and you'd never pick her for the sort that would run clean off with a gent like Barry. Now, Barry himself wasn't so bad for looks, but they'll tell you in Elkhead how bad he is in action, and maybe they's some widders in Alder that could put in a word. Now, take even the kid. She looks no more'n a baby, but what do you know is inside of her? Speaking personal, gents, I don't put no kind of trust in that houseful yonder. Here they come in the middle of the night like there was a posse after 'em. They climb that house and sit down and eat like they'd ridden all day. Maybe they had. Even while they was eating, they didn't seem none too happy. That loose shutter upstairs come around in the wind with a bang, and Gus Daniels jumped out of his chair as fast as powder could blow him. Now, he didn't say nothing, just sat down looking kind of sick, and the other two was the same way. When they talked, they'd bust off in the middle of a word and let their eyes go trailing into some corner of the room that was plumb full of shadow. Then Lee Haines gets up and walks up and down.
"Swann," says he, "how many good men have you got on the place?" "Why," says I, "they're all good." "Huh," says Haines. He puts a hand on my shoulder. "Just how good are they, Swann?" I seen what he wanted. He wanted to know how many scrappy gents was punching cows here. Maybe them three up there figures that they might need help. For what? What was they running away from?
"Hey!" broke in one of the cowpunchers, pointing with a dramatic fork through the window. It was a bright spot of gold that disappeared over the top of the nearest hill. Then it came into view again, the whole body of a yellow-haired child, clothed in a wisp of white and running steadily toward the north.
"The kid!" gasped the foreman. "Boys, grab her. No, you'll bust her. I know how to handle her."
He was gone through the door with gigantic leaps and shot over the crest of the low hill. Then those in the cookhouse heard a small, tingling scream. After it came silence and the tall foreman striding across the hill with the child high in his arms. He came panting through the door and stood her up on one end of the table, a small and fearless creature. She wore on her feet the little moccasins which Dan himself had fashioned for her. But the tawny hide was not on her. Perhaps her mother had thrown the garment away. The moccasins and the white nightgown were the sum and substance of her apparel, and the cowpunchers stood up around the table to admire her spunk.
"Damn near spat pison," observed Ben Swann, "when I hung into her. Tried to bite me, but the minute I got her in my hands she quit struggling, as reasonable as a grown-up, by God."
"Shut up, Ben. Don't you know no better than to cuss in front of a kid?" The great dark eyes of Joan went somberly from face to face. If she was afraid, she disguised it well. But now and then, like a wild thing which sees that escape is impossible, she looked through the window and out over the open country beyond.
"Where was you headed for, honey?"
queried Ben Swann. The child considered him bravely for a time before she replied.
"Over there." Now what might she mean by that? Headed for Elkhead in a nightgown? Any place I could take you, kid?
If she did not altogether trust Ben Swann, at least she preferred him to the other unshaven, work-thinned faces which leered at her around the table.
"Daddy Dan," she said softly. "Joan wants to go to Daddy Dan." "Daddy Dan, Dan Barry," translated Ben Swann, and he drew a bit away from her. "Boys, that man-killing devil must be round here. And that's what them up to the house was running from, Barry."
It scattered the others to the windows, to the door.
"What'd you see?"
"Nothing."
"Swann, if Barry's comin' these parts, I'm gonna pack my war bag."
"Me too, Ben.
Them as get 10,000'll earn it."
"I heard about the killing at Alder."
"Listen to me, gents,"
observed Ben Swann.
"If Barry is comin' here, we ain't none of us gonna stay, but don't start jumpin' out from under till I get the straight of it. I'm gonna take the kid up to the house right now and find out."
So he wrapped up Joan in an old blanket, for she was shivering in the cold of the early morning, and carried her up to the ranch house. The alarm had already been given. He saw Buck Daniels gallop toward the front of the place, leading 2 saddle horses. He saw Haines and Kate run down the steps to meet them, and then they caught sight of the foreman coming with Joan on his shoulder. The joy of that meeting, it seemed to Ben Swann, was decidedly one-sided. Kate ran to Joan with a little wailing cry of happiness and gathered her close, but neither big Lee Haines nor ugly Buck Daniels seemed overcome with happiness at the regaining of Joan, and the child herself merely endured the caresses of her mother. Ben Swann made them a speech. He told them that anybody with half an eye could tell they were bothered by something, that they acted as if they were running away. Now, running in itself was perfectly all right and quite in order when it was impossible to outface or outbluff a danger. He himself, Ben Swann, believed in such tactics. He wasn't a soldier, he was a cowpuncher. So were the rest of the boys out yonder, and though they'd stay by their work in ordinary times and they'd face ordinary trouble, they were not minded to abide the coming of Dan Barry.
"So," concluded Swann, "I want to ask you straight. Is him they call Whistlin' Dan comin' this way? Are you runnin' from him? And did you steal a kid from him?"
Lee Haines took upon his competent shoulders the duty of answering.
"Do you look like a sensible man, Swann?" he said severely. "I'm surprised at you. In the first place, two men don't run away from one."
A fleeting smile appeared and disappeared on the lips of Ben Swann. Haines hastily went on.
"As for stealing the baby from Dan Barry, good heavens, man, don't you think a mother has a right to her own child? Now go back to that scared bunch and tell them that Dan Barry is back in the Grizzly Peaks."
For several reasons this did not completely satisfy the foreman, but he postponed his decision. Lee Haines spoke like one in the habit of giving orders, and Swann walked slowly back to the cookhouse. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Keiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 38. The New Alliance.
"And so," said Lee Haines when he joined Buck Daniels in the living room, "there goes our reinforcements. That whole crew will scatter like dead leaves when Barry breezes in. It looks to me—"
"Shut up," cut in Daniels. "Shut up." His dark, homely face turned to the larger man with a singular expression of awe. He whispered,
"D'you hear? She's in the next room whipping Joan for running away, and never a yap out of the kid."
He held up a lean finger for caution, and then Haines heard the sound of the willow switch. It stopped.
"If you run away again," warned Kate, her voice pitched high and trembling, "Munner will whip harder and put you in a dark place for a long, long time."
Still there was not a sound of the child's voice, not even the pulse of stifled weeping. Presently the door opened and Kate stood there.
"Go out in the kitchen and tell Li to give you breakfast. Naughty girls can't eat with Munner."
Through the door came Joan, her little round face perfectly white, perfectly expressionless. She did not cringe passing her mother. She walked steadily across the room, rose on tiptoe to open the kitchen door, and disappeared through it. Kate dropped into a chair, shaking.
"Out," whispered Buck to Lee Haines. "Beat it. I got to talk alone."
And as soon as Haines obeyed, Buck sat down close to the girl. She was twisting and untangling her fingers in a dumb agony.
"What has he done to her, Buck? What has he done?"
It was a maxim with Buck that talk is to women what swearing is to man. It is a safety valve, and therefore he waited in silence until the first rush of her grief had passed.
"She only looked at me when I whipped her. My heart turned in me. She didn't cry. She wasn't even angry. She just stood there, my baby, and looked at me."
She threw herself back in the chair with her eyes closed, and he saw where the trouble had marked her face. He wanted to lean over and take her in his arms.
"I'm going mad, Buck. I can't stand it. How could he have changed her to this?"
"Listen to me, Kate. Joan ain't been changed. She's only showing what she is."
The mother stared wildly at him.
"Don't look at me like I was a murderer. God knows I'm sorry, Kate, but if they's Dan's blood in your little girl, it ain't my fault. It ain't anything he's taught her. It's just that being alone with him has brought out what she really is."
"I won't believe you, Buck. I don't dare listen to you."
"You got to listen, Kate, because you know I'm right. Do you think any kind of teaching could make her learn how to stand and keep from crying when she was whipped?"
"I know."
She spoke softly, as if some terrible power might overhear them talk, and Buck lowered his voice in turn.
"She's wild, Kate. I knew it when I seen the way she handled Bart. She's wild."
"Then I'll have her tame again."
"You tried that once and failed."
"Dan was a man when I tried, and his nature was formed. Joan is only a baby, my baby. She's half mine. She has my hair and my eyes."
I don't care what the color of her eyes is. I know what's behind 'em. Look at 'em, and then tell me who she takes after."
"Buck, why do you talk like this? What do you want me to do?"
"A hard thing. Send Joan back to Dan.
"Never."
He'll never give her up, I tell you."
"Oh, God help me. What shall I do? I'll keep her. I'll make her tame."
"But you'll never keep her that way. Think of Dan. Think of the yeller in his eyes, Kate."
"Until I die," she said with sudden quiet, "I'll fight to keep her."
And he answered with equal solemnity,
"Until Dan dies, he'll fight to have her, and he's never been beat yet."
Through a breathing space he stared at her and she at him, and the eyes of Buck Daniels were the first to turn. Everything that was womanly and gentle had died from her face, and in its stead was something which made Buck rise and wander from the room. He found Lee Haines and told him briefly all that had passed. The great battle, they decided, had begun between Kate and Barry for the sake of the child, and that battle would go on until one of them was dead or the prize for which they struggled lost. Barry would come on the trail and find them at the ranch, and then he would strike for Joan, and they had no help for the struggle against him. The cowpunchers would scatter at the first sign of Barry, at the first shrill of his ill-omened whistling. They might ride for Elkhead and raise a posse from among the citizens, but it would take 2 days to do that and gather a number of effective fighters for the crisis. And in the meantime, the chances were large that Barry would strike the ranch while the messenger was away. There was really nothing to do but sit patiently and wait. They were both brave men, very, and they were both not unpracticed fighters, but they began to wait for the coming of Barry as the prisoner waits for the day of his execution. It spoke well of the quality of their nerves that they would not speak to Kate of the time to come. They sat back like spectators at a play and watched the maneuvers of the mother to win back Joan. There was not an idle moment from breakfast to dark. They went out to gather wildflowers on the western hill from the house. They sat on the veranda where Kate told Joan stories of the ranch and pointed out the distant mountains which were its boundaries, and explained that all between them would one day be her own land, and that the men who rode yonder were doing her work, that the cattle who ranged the hills were marked with her brand. She said it all in small words so that Joan could understand, but as far as Buck and Lee could make out, there was never a flicker of intelligence or interest in the eyes of the child. It was a hard battle every hour, and after supper Kate sat in a big chair by the fire with her eyes half closed, admitting defeat perhaps. For Joan was curled up on the couch at the farthest, dimmest end of the room, and with her chin propped in both small hands, she stared in silence through the window and over the darkening hills. Buck and Lee were there, never speaking, but now and then their eyes sought each other with a vague hope. For Kate might see that her task was impossible, send Joan back, and that would free them of the danger. But where Kate left off, chance took up the battle and turned the scales. Old Li, the Chinese cook, had not seen Kate for 6 long years, and now he celebrated the return by hanging about her on 1,000 pretexts. It was just after he had brought in some delicacy from the kitchen, leaving the door a little ajar, when a small ball of gray fur nosed its way through the aperture and came straight for the glare of the fire on the hearth. It was a small shepherd puppy, and having observed the faces of the men with bright, unafraid eyes, it went wobbling on to the very hearth, sniffling. Even at that age it knew enough to keep away from the bright coals of wood, but how could it know that the dark, cold-looking andiron had been heated to the danger point by the fire? It thrust out a tentative nose, touched the iron, and then its shrill yelp of pain went startlingly through the room. It pulled the three grown-ups out of their thoughts and brought Joan scampering across the room with a little happy cry. The puppy would have escaped if it could, for it had in mind the dark, warm, familiar corner in Li's kitchen where no harm ever came near. But the agile hands of Joan caught him. He was swept into her arms. That little wail of helpless pain, the soft fluff of fur against her cheek, wiped all other things from Joan's mind. Out the window and across the gloomy hills she had been staring at the picture of the cave, and the bright-eyed Satan, and the shadowy form of Bart, and the swift, gentle hand of Daddy Dan. But the cry of the puppy blotted the picture out. She was no longer lonely, having this small, soft body to protect. There sat her mother, leaning a little toward her with a glance at once misted and bright, and she forgot forthwith all the agency of Kate in carrying her away from that cave of delight.
"Look, Munner, he's burned his nose."
The puppy was licking the injured nose industriously and whimpering the while, and Joan heard no answer from her mother except an inarticulate little sound somewhere deep in Kate's throat. Over her child mind, vaguely like all baby memories, moved a recollection of the same sound, coming deeply from the throat of the mother and marvelously soothing, reassuring. It moved a fiber of trust and sympathy in Joan, an emotion as real as the sound of music, and with the puppy held idly in her arms for a moment, she looked curiously into Kate's face. On her own, a faint smile began in the eyes and spread to the lips.
"Poor little puppy, Munner," said Joan.
The hands of Kate trembled with desire to bring Joan closer to her, but very wisely she merely stroked the cringing head of the dog. "Poor little puppy," she echoed. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Keiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 39. Victory. The entrance of the puppy, to liken small things to great, was the coming of Blucher in Kate's life, for the battle turned, and all in 5 minutes she had gone from defeat to victory. She sat by the fire with Joan sleeping in her arms, and the puppy in turn in the arms of Joan. It was such a foolish trick of chance that had given her all this. She was almost inclined to laugh, but something of tragedy in the faces of Buck and Lee Haines made her thoroughly serious. And she readily saw the truth, for after all a child's brain is a small affair. It holds so much and no more. One instant the longing for Dan was all that Joan could think of. The next she had no room for anything more than the burned nose of the puppy. And there were other phases to this matter, such as Buck Daniels had pointed out. Fear that in some future crisis the blood of the father might show in the child. Kate pushed those thoughts away. She was too full of the present happiness. Now, while she sat there in the firelight, she sang softly into the dreams of Joan and watched the smile of sleep grow and wane faintly on the lips of the child as the rhythm of her singing lifted and fell. One half of her mind was empty, that part where Dan should have been, and a dozen times she checked an impulse to turn to him in the place where he should be sitting and invite him with a smile to share her happiness. When her eyes moved, they only fell on the gaunt, intent face of Buck or the leonine head of Haines. Whistling Dan was gone, and if he ever came again, her fear of him, her fear for Joan, would be greater than her love. Yet Dan being gone so finally, she knew that she would never be truly happy again. Her spring of life was ended. But even now she was grateful for the full richness of those 6 years with Dan. And if she turned from him now, it was only because a mighty instinct commanded her and a voice without words drove her. Joan must go on to a normal, womanly happiness. Dan Barry lived from day to day, glutting himself with a ride in the wind, or the whistle of a far-off bird, or the wail of a mountain lion through the night. Each instant was to him complete, but the eye of Kate looked far away and saw the night when this daughter of hers should sit holding an infant by such a fire, and her heart was both empty and full. It was no wonder, then, that she heard the first sound long before either Haines or Buck Daniels, for her mind was on guard against dangers which might threaten her baby. It was a faint slipping, scratching noise on the veranda, then a breathing at the front door. Kate turned, and the men followed the terror of her eyes in time to see the door fall open and a broad paw appear in the interval. The snaky head of Black Bart thrust into the room. Without a word, Daniels drew his gun. "Wait!" commanded Kate. Joan awoke with a start at the sharpness of this voice. "Don't shoot, Buck. See that bit of paper under his throat? He's bringing a message."
"Bart!"
cried Joan, slipping to the floor from her mother's lap. But when she ran toward the wolf dog, that tremendous snarl of warning stopped her short. Bart slunk toward Kate. "Look out, Kate!" cried Haines. "The black devil means murder." "Don't move or he'll go at your throat," she answered. "There's no danger to me. He's been ordered to go to me, and he won't let even Joan touch him. See?" He had glided past the amazed, outstretched arms of Joan and went straight to Kate and stopped beside her, obviously expectant. She reached for the slip of folded paper, and as her hand approached, he crouched a little, growling, but it was only to caution her, apparently, and though he distrusted the hand, he allowed it to unfasten the missive. She untwisted the note. She read aloud: "Kate, send Joan back to me, or I come for her. Send her with Bart." It seemed as though the wolf dog understood the written words, for now he moved toward Joan, and she, with a cry, dropped the squealing puppy and caught the great head of Bart in her arms. The puppy wailed, sitting down on his haunches and quivering with grief.
"Daddy Dan wants me," explained Joan with bright eyes. "He sent for me. Go, quick, Bart."
The big animal lay down to facilitate her mounting. "Joan!" called Kate. The child hesitated and turned toward her. Her mother had taken up that light revolver which Dan had taught her to use so well, and now, as she leveled it at the wolf dog, Bart laid his fangs bare in silent hate. The weapons of Buck and Lee Haines were ready, and now Bart raised himself a little and commenced to drag gradually forward to leaping distance. "Drop your gun, Kate," cautioned Buck. "For God's sake, drop your gun. Even if you hit him with a bullet, he'll be at your throat. Unless you kill him with the first shot, he'll have you. Drop your gun, and then he'll go at us." But Joan knew perfectly well what those gleaming bits of metal meant. She had seen Daddy Dan shoot and kill, and now she ran screaming between Bart and danger.
"Munner!" she cried. "You bad, bad men! I won't let you hurt Bart." "They won't hurt you, Bart," explained Joan, taming much mollified to the great wolf dog. "They just playin'. Now we'll go." And she started toward the door, with Bart slinking in front and keeping a watchful lookout from a corner of his eye. "Are you going to leave the poor little puppy, Joan?" said the mother, keeping her voice steady, for all the force of the two men could not help her now. It rested with her wit. "I'll take him with me," answered Joan, and caught up the howling puppy from the floor. His wails died out against her breast. "But you mustn't do that, honey. He'll die in this cold night wind long before you get there." "Oh," sighed Joan, and considered her mother with great eyes. Black Bart turned and uneasily tugged at her dress. "Will you take good care of him, Munner, till I come back?" "But I don't know how to take care of him, dear. If you go, he'll cry and cry and cry until he dies." Joan sighed. "See how quiet he is when you hold him, Joan?" "Oh," muttered Joan again. The distress of the problem made her wrinkle her forehead. She turned to Kate for help. "Munner, what'll I do?" "You'd best stay here until the puppy is strong enough to go with you."
She kept her voice well under control. It would not do to show the slightest emotion, and now she sat down and half turned away from the child. With her eyes she flashed a signal at the two troubled men, and they followed her lead. Their center of vision was now upon the fire. It left Joan, to all appearances, quite out of notice.
"Oh, that'll be a long, long time, munner."
"Only a little while, Joan."
"But Daddy Dan'll be lonesome up there."
"He has Satan and Bart to keep him company."
"Don't you think he wants Joan, munner?"
"Not as much as the poor little puppy wants you, Joan," she added, with just the slightest tremor. "You decide for yourself, Joan. Go if you think it is best."
"Bart, what'll Joan do?"
queried the child, turning in dismay toward the wolf dog. But as soon as he saw the puppy in her arms, he greeted her with a murderous snarl. "You see," suggested her mother, "that Black Bart would eat up the poor little puppy if you went now with him." At this alarming thought, Joan shrank away from Bart, and when he followed her anxiously, she cried,
"Go away! Bad dog! Bad Bart!"
He caught the edge of her dress and drew back toward the door, and this threw Joan into a sudden panic. She struck Bart across his wrinkled forehead.
"Go away!"
He slunk back, snarling at the puppy.
"Go back to Daddy Dan."
Then, as he pricked his ears, still growling like distant thunder,
"Go tell Daddy Dan that Joan has to stay here a while." "Munner, how long?"
"Maybe a week, dear."
"A whole week?"
she cried, dismayed. "Perhaps only 1 or 2 or 3 days," said Kate. Some of her tenseness was leaving as she saw victory once more inclining to her standards.
1, 2, 5 days,"
counted Joan.
"And then come for me again. Tell Daddy Dan that, Bart."
His eyes left her and wandered around the room, lingering for a vicious instant on the face of each. Then he backed toward the door. "He's clear of Joan now, Kate," whispered Buck. "Let me shoot."
No, don't even look at him."
Then, with a scratching of sudden claws, Bart whirled at the door and was gone like a bolt down the hall. Afterwards, for a time, there was no sound in the room except the murmurings of Joan to her puppy. And then they heard the most mournful of sounds on the mountain desert, the long howl of a wolf which has missed its kill and hunts hungry on a new trail. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Keiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 40. The Failure. When Black Bart returned without Joan, without even a note of answer about his neck, the master made ready to take by force. First he went over his new outfit of saddle and guns, looking to every strap of the former, and the latter, revolvers and rifle, he weighed and balanced with a meditative look, as if he were memorizing their qualities against a time of need. With Satan saddled and Bart on guard at the mouth of the cave, he gathered up all the accumulation of odds and ends, provisions, skins, and made a stirring bonfire in the middle of the gravel floor. It was like burning his bridges before starting out to the battle. He turned his back to the cave and started on his journey. He had to travel in a loose semicircle, for there were 2 points which he must reach on the ride: the town of Alder, where lived the 7th man who must die for Grey Molly, and the Cumberland ranch, last of all, where he would take Joan. Very early after his start he reached the plateau where he had lived all those years with Kate, and he found it already sinking back to ruin, with nothing in the corrals, and the front door swinging to and fro idly in the wind, just as Joan had often played with it. Inside, he knew, the rooms were empty. A current of air down the chimney had scattered the ashes from the hearth all about the living room. Here must be a chair overturned, and there the sand had drifted through the open door. All this he saw clearly enough with his mind's eye, and urged Satan forward. For a chill like the falling of sudden night had swept over him, and he shrugged his shoulders with relief when he swept past the house. Yet when he came to the long downslope which pitched into the valley so far below him, he called Satan to a halt again and swung to look at the house. He could hear the clatter of the front door as it swung. It seemed to be waving a farewell to him. It was all the work of a moment to ride back, gather a quantity of paper and readily inflammable materials, soak them in oil, and scratch a match. The flames swept up the sides of the logs and caught on the ceiling first of all, and Dan Barry stood in the center of the room until the terrified whining of Black Bart and the teeth of the wolf dog at his trousers made him turn and leave the house. Outside, he found Satan trembling between two temptations. The first to run as far and as fast as he could from that most terrible thing, fire, and the second to gallop straight into the blaze. The voice of the master, a touch, quieted him, and Black Bart lay down at the feet of the master and looked up into his face. By this time the fire had licked away a passage through the roof, and through this it sent up a yellow hand that flickered up and down like a signal or a beckoning, and then shot up a tall, steady, growing, roaring column of red. No man could say what went through the mind of Dan Barry as he stood there watching the house of his building burn. But now he turned and threw his arms over the neck and back of Satan and dropped his forehead against the withers of the black. It troubled the stallion. He turned his head and nosed the shoulder of the master gently, and Black Bart, in an agony of anxiety, reared up beside Dan and brought his head almost up to the head of the man. There he whined pleadingly, for never before had he seen the master hide his face. A deep, short report made the master stand away from Satan. The fire had reached a small stock of powder, and the shock of the explosion was followed by a great crashing and rending as an inner wall went down. That fall washed a solid mass of yellow flame across the front door, but the fire fell back, and then Dan saw the doll which he himself had made for Joan. It had been thrown by the smashing of the wall squarely in front of the door, and now the fire reached after it, long arms across the floor. It was an odd contrivance, singularly made of carved wood and with arms and legs fastened on by means of bits of strong sinew, and Joan prized it above all the rosy-faced dolls which Kate had bought for her. For an instant Dan stood watching the progress of the fire, then he leaped through the door, swerved back as an arm of fire shot out at him, ran forward again, caught up the doll, and was outside rubbing away the singed portions of brows and lashes. He did not wait until the house was consumed, but when the flames stood towering above the roof, shaking out to one side with a roar when the wind struck them, he mounted Satan once more and made for the valley. He wanted to reach Alder at dark, and he gauged the time of his ride so accurately that when he pulled out of the mouth of Murphy's Pass, the last light of the day was still on the mountains and in the pass, but it was already dark in the village, and a score of lights twinkled up at him like eyes. He left Satan and Bart well outside the town, for even in the dark they might easily be recognized, and then walked straight down the street of Alder. It was a bold thing to do, but he knew that the first thing which is seen and suspected is the skulker who approaches from covert to covert. They knew he had ridden into Alder before in the middle of the night, and they might suspect the danger of such another attack, but they surely would not have fear of a solitary pedestrian unless a telltale light were thrown upon his face. He passed Captain Lorrimer's saloon. Even in this short interval it had fallen into ill repute after the killing at Alder. And a shanty further down the street now did the liquor business of the town. Captain Lorrimer's was closed, and the window nailed across with slats. He went on, partly by instinct and partly because it was aflame with lights, he moved straight to the house at which he had learned tidings of 3 men he sought on his last visit to Alder. Now there were more lights showing from the windows of that place than there were in all the rest of Alder. At the hitching rack in front, horses stood tethered in long double rows, and a noise of voices rolled out and up and down the street. Undoubtedly there was a festival there, and all Alder would turn out for such an affair. All Alder including Vic Gregg, the 7th man. A group came down the street for the widow's house. They were laughing and shouting, and they carried lanterns. Away from them Barry slipped like a ghost and stood in the shadow of the house. There might be other such crowds, and they were dangerous to Barry. So now he hunted for a means of breaking into the house of the widow unseen. The windows, as he went down the side of the building, he noted to be high, but not too high to be reached by a skillful, noiseless climber. In the back of the house he saw the kitchen door, illuminated indeed, but the room, as far as he could see, empty. Then very suddenly a wave of silence began somewhere in a side of the house and swept across it, dying to a murmur at the edges. Barry waited for no more maneuvers, but walked boldly up the back stairs and entered the house, hat in hand. The moment he passed the door he was alert, balanced. He could have swung to either side or whirled and shot behind him with the precision of a leisurely marksman. And as he walked he smiled, happily, with his head held high. He seemed so young then that one would have said he had just come in gaily from some game with the other youths of Alder. Out of the kitchen he passed into the hall, and there he understood the meaning of the silence, for both the doors to the front room were open, and through the doors he heard a single voice, deep and solemn, and through the doors he saw the crowd standing motionless. Their heads did not stir, heads on which the hair was plastered smoothly down. And when someone raised a hand to touch an itching ear or nose, he moved his arm in such caution that it seemed he feared to set a magazine of powder on fire. All their backs were towards Barry, where he stood in the hall, and as he glided toward them he heard the deep voice stop, and then the trembling voice of a girl speak in reply. At the first entrance he paused, for the whole scene unrolled before him. It was a wedding. Just in front of him, on chairs and even on benches, sat the majority of adult Alder. Facing these stood the wedding pair, with the minister just in front of them. He could see the girl to one side of the minister's back, and she was very pretty, very femininely appealing now, in a dress which was a cloudy effect of white. But Barry gave her only one sharp glance. His attention was for the men of the crowd, and although there were only backs of heads and side glimpses of faces, he hunted swiftly for Vic Gregg. But Gregg was not there. He surveyed the assembly twice, incredulous, for surely the tall man should be here. But when he was on the very point of turning on his heel and slinking down the hall to pursue his hunt in other quarters, the voice of the minister stopped, and the deep tone of Vic himself rolled through the room. It startled Barry like a voice out of the sky. He stared about, bewildered, and then as the minister shifted his position a little, he saw that it was Gregg who stood beside the girl in white. It was Gregg being married. And at the same moment the eyes of Vic lifted, wandered, fell upon the face which stood there framed in the dark of the doorway. Dan saw the flush die out, saw the narrow, single-purposed face of Gregg turn white, saw his eyes widen, and his own hand closed on his gun. Another instant. The minister turned his head, seemed to be waiting, and then Gregg spoke in answer. "I will." 1,000 pictures rushed through the mind of Barry, and he remembered first and last the wounded man on the gray horse who he had saved, and the long, hard ride carrying that limp body to the cabin in the mountains. The man would fight. By the motion of Gregg's hand, Dan knew that he had gone even to his wedding armed. He had only to show his own gun to bring on the crisis. And in the meantime the eyes of Vic held steadily upon him past the shoulder of the minister, without fear, desperately. In spite of himself, Dan's hand could not move his gun. In spite of himself, he looked to the confused, happy face of the girl, and he felt as he had felt when he set fire to his house up there in the hills. The wavering lasted only a moment longer. Then he turned and slipped noiselessly down the hall, and the seventh man who should have died for Grey Molly was still alive. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Seventh Man, the last chapter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, reading by Robert Keiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 41. The Wild Geese. 24 hours from Alder to Elkhead and beyond Elkhead to the Cumberland Ranch is long riding and hard riding. But not far after dark on the following night, Joan lifted her head where she played with the puppy on the hearth and listened. There was no sound audible to the others in the living room. They did not even mark the manner in which she sat up and then rose to her feet. But when she whispered, "Daddy Dan," it brought each of the three out of his chair. Still they heard nothing, and Buck and Lee Haines would have retaken their chairs had not Kate gone to the window and thrown it wide. Then they caught it, very far off, very thin and small, a delicate thread of music, an eerie whistling. Without a word, she closed the window, crossed the room, and from the table she took up a cartridge belt from which hung the holster with the revolver which Whistling Dan had taught her to use so well. She buckled it around her. Lee Haines and Daniels, without a word, imitated her actions. Their guns were already on. Every moment since they reached the ranch they had gone armed, but now they looked to them and tried the actions a few times before they thrust them back into the holsters. It was odd to watch them. They were like the last remnant of a garrison, outworn with fighting, which prepares in grim quiet for the final stand. The whistling rose a little in volume now. It was a happy sound, without a recognizable tune, but a gay, wild improvisation, as if a violinist, drunk, was remembering snatches of masterpieces, throwing out lovely fragments here and there, and filling the intervals out of his own excited fancy. Joan ran to the window, forgetful of the puppy, and kneeled there in the chair looking out. The whistling stopped as Kate drew down the curtain to cut out Joan's view. It was far too dark for the child to see out, but she often would sit like this, looking into the dark. The whistling began again as Joan turned silently on her mother, uncomplaining, but with a singular glint in her eyes, a sort of flickering, inward light that came out by glances and starts. Now the sound of the rider grew closer and closer. Kate gestured the men to their positions, one for each of the two inner doors, while she herself took the outer one. There was not a trace of color in her face, but otherwise she was as calm as a stone, and from her an atmosphere pervaded the room, so the men also stood quietly at their posts, without a word, without a sign to each other. They had their unspoken order from Kate. She would resist to the death, and she expected the same from them. They were prepared. Still, that crescendo of the whistling continued. It seemed as if it would never reach them. It grew loud as a bird singing in that very room, and still it continued to swell, increase, then suddenly went out. As if it were the signal for which she had been waiting all these heartbreaking moments, Kate opened the front door, ran quickly down the hall, and stood an instant later on the path in front of the house. She had locked the doors as she went through, and now she heard one of the men rattling the lock to follow her. The rattling ceased. Evidently they decided that they would hold the fort as they were. Her heel hardly sank in the sand when she saw him. He came out of the night like a black shadow among shadows, with the speed of the wind to carry him. A light creak of leather as he halted, a glimmer of starlight on Satan as he wheeled, a clink of steel, and then Dan was coming up the path. She knew him perfectly, even before she could make out the details of the form. She knew him by the light, swift, almost noiseless step, like the padding footfall of a great cat, a sense of weight without sound. Another form skulked behind him. Black Bart. He was close, very close, before he stopped or seemed to see her, though she felt that he must have been aware of her since he first rode up. He was so close, indeed, that the starlight, the brim of his hat standing up somewhat from the swift riding, showed his face quite clearly to her. It was boyish almost, in its extreme youth, and so thinly molded, and his frame so lightly made, that he seemed one risen from a wasted bed of sickness. The wind fluttered his shirt, and she wondered, as she had wondered so often before, where he gained that incredible strength in so meager a body. In all her life she had never loved him as she loved him now, but her mind was as fixed as a star. "You can't have her, Dan. You can't have her. Don't you see how terrible a thing you'd make her? She's my blood, my pain, my love, and you want to take her up yonder to the mountains and the loneliness. I'll die to keep her." Now the moon, which had been buried in a drift of clouds, broke through them, and seemed on an instant to slide a vast distance toward the earth, a crooked half moon with its edges eaten by the mist. Under this light she could see him more clearly, and she became aware of the thing she dreaded, the faint smile which barely touched at the corners of his mouth, and in his eyes a swirl of yellow light, half guessed at, half real. All her strength poured out of her. She felt her knees buckle, felt the fingers about the light revolver butt relax, felt every nerve grow slack. She was helpless. And it was not fear of the man, but something which stalked behind him, inhuman, irresistible, not the wolf dog, but something more than Satan and Bart and Whistling Dan, something of which they were only a part. He began to whistle, thoughtfully, like one who considers a plan of action and yet hesitates to begin. She felt his eyes run over her, as if judging how he should put her most gently to one side. Then from the house, very lightly, hardly more than an echo of Dan's whistling, came an answer, the very same refrain. Joan was calling to him. At that he stepped forward, but the thing which stirred him had hardened the mind of Kate. The weakness passed in a flash. It was Joan, and for Joan. "Not a step," she whispered, and jerked out her gun. "Not a step." He stood with one hand trailing carelessly from his hip, and at the gleam of her steel his other hand dropped to his holster, fumbled there, and came away empty. He could not touch her, not with the weight of a finger. That thoughtful whistle came again. Once more the answering whistle drifted out from the house, and he moved forward another pace. She had chosen her mark carefully, the upper corner of the seam of the pocket upon his shirt, and before his foot struck the ground she fired. For an instant she felt she had missed the mark, for he stood perfectly upright. But then she saw that the yellow was gone from his eyes. They were empty of everything except a great wonder. He wavered to his knees, and then sank down with his arms around Black Bart. He seemed indeed to crumple away into the night. Then she heard a shouting and trampling in the house and a breaking open of doors, and she knew that she had killed Whistling Dan. She would have gone to him, but the snarl of Bart drove her back. Then she saw Satan galloping up the path and come to a sliding halt where he stood, with his delicate nose close to the face of the master. There was no struggle with death, only a sigh, like a motion of wind in far-off trees, and then, softly, easily, Black Bart extricated himself from the master and moved away down the path, all wolf, all wild. Behind him, Satan whirled with a snort, and they rushed away into the night, each in an opposite direction. The long companionship of the three was ended, and the seventh man was dead for Grey Molly. Lee Haines and Buck Daniels were around her now. She heard nothing distinctly, only a great vague clamor of voices while she kneeled and turned the body of Barry on its back. It was marvelously light. She could almost have picked it up in her arms, she felt. She folded the hands across his breast, and the limp fingers were delicate as the fingers of a sick child. Buck Daniels lay prone by the dead man, weeping aloud, and Lee Haines stood with his face buried in his hands. But there were no tears on the face of Kate. As she closed the eyes, the empty, hollow eyes, she heard a distant calling, a hoarse and dissonant chiming. She looked up and saw a wedge of wild geese flying low across the moon. End of The Seventh Man by Max Brand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robert Keiper. Fairfax, Virginia, December 2009, January 2010.